What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 video games that I don't think you should 100%. As a channel that focuses primarily on reviewing things after 100%, people often ask me if there are games I didn't enjoy that much or if the 100% hurts the experience in some way. And obviously, yeah, in some cases I do think it is not really worth the effort if you aren't, say, doing it for a living and getting paid for it, as that pretty much gives me the time to no-life these things. But I do want to clarify here at the beginning, I don't really think any of these are bad games, outside of maybe one of them, which is debatable, I suppose, so much as the experience of getting 100% was either tedious or just a tremendous effort in some cases. But in the case of this particular video, there's actually a couple games on this list that I have not reviewed before, but I do have 100% on, so I thought this would be a fun way to talk about them a little bit and mix things up a little. To kick this video off, I thought it would be fun to start with a game that hasn't really made it onto one of these lists before because I enjoy it so much, and that is Pathfinder: Wrath of the Righteous. If you've watched this channel for any length of time, I'm sure you've heard me go on about it to some degree, because it is, in fact, my favorite game. But it is also a game I definitely don't think people should be 100%ing, because it is an extreme time investment into what is already a bit of a game that is hard for newcomers to get into in particular. But I've seen estimates that 100% on Pathfinder takes probably 500 plus hours for many people, and I would say that's about right. I have like 700 something, including the early access and beta periods and stuff. But just with the release version alone, I've got like 570 hours in it, which will be going up more shortly when the DLC drops and there are more achievements and content to do. But even then, that is a mostly concerted effort to doing just that, getting 100% on it, because the game is incredibly dense. There's a lot of obscure stuff to do and find, and for instance, I spent over 80 hours on just one DLC, which was the Midnight Isles one. However, as intimidating as all that could be to someone, that's to say nothing of achievements like sadistic game design that see you running through the game on a very specific difficulty, while also only resting less than 75 times and killing all optional bosses as early as it is possible to do so, maxing out the crusade, etc. And that's all just for one achievement. So it doesn't even include things like beating the game on the hardest difficulty, which is literally called unfair, or beating the game on its Iron Man mode. So what I'm trying to say is that 100%ing Wrath of the Righteous is a lot, even for someone who loves those games. And seeing how I want people to play more CRPGs, I can reasonably admit that it's not for everyone, especially to that degree. And honestly, I'd be happy if people just played through it once. But that brings us to number 2 on the list with The Witcher 2. Another favorite of mine, as the Witcher series in general is really good, but believe it or not, The Witcher 2 is my favorite of the 3, especially in terms of its story. However, the problem with The Witcher 2 is that it has some glaring issues, namely the combat system being broken, especially in terms of its hitboxes, things like that, and that makes doing things like getting the achievement for the Iron Man mode quite difficult. And while that's reason enough not to 100% it for most people, I imagine, the reason I wouldn't suggest 100%ing this one actually has nothing to do with the achievements in particular. It's the fact that the game, in spite of its achievements, actually has about 16 different endings. And while you don't need to see all of them for the achievements by any means, I do think it is safe to say that if you want to see everything that that game has to offer, you've got 16 endings to see. And while that can be save-scum to some degree to make different decisions at certain points, it's still an incredible amount of game time, which is why I myself only recently finished that 100% despite starting it in like 2012, but finishing it earlier this year when I actually decided to go back and do a retrospective review for the thing. And for me, the story is enough to carry that experience. I genuinely think a lot of it is interesting, but when you consider that The Witcher 3 makes most of those endings irrelevant anyway, on top of problems with things like the combat and the Iron Man mode, for instance, 100%ing The Witcher 2 is a bit of an ordeal if you really want to see all of it. And while I would recommend 2 or 3 playthroughs just to see the major pass through the game, much beyond that point, and you're more than likely just not going to be having a good time with it anymore, so it's hard to recommend in terms of its 100%. As a game, though, you should definitely play it. It's pretty great. Now, on a slightly different note for number 3, we have a game called Redemption Reapers that I did not review earlier this year, but I did do a checkout video for. This was a TRPG that launched, I want to say back in like February or March, And to put it kindly, I just don't think the game is very good. It wasn't even on my radar until some people had asked me to check it out for a potential review, and while I made a checkout video on the title, I wound up deciding not to review it because after finishing everything, it occurred to me that I really didn't have much positive to say outside of what I had already said in the checkout video I made for it, and I didn't really want to write a review where I basically spent the entire thing rehashing what I didn't like from the checkout video. And what I didn't like about this game was that it had a myriad of technical problems on its release. It didn't support resolutions above 1080 at the time, for instance, and I game on 4K monitors. It also would just crash randomly. It had a lot of issues with progression and you not having enough currency to maintain your troop over the course of the game, which could cause a lot of issues. And while some of that stuff they patched pretty quickly, none of that really changed the fact that as a tactics game, it was okay at best, with the only really good thing I would say about it is that the art direction was pretty cool. And you combine all those problems with a $50 price tag, and it was just not a game I could recommend, so I didn't wind up reviewing it fully, since my checkout video, as I said, had pretty much said everything I had to say on it already. So if that didn't make it obvious, the reason that you shouldn't 100% this one is because it's simply not that great of a game, and that's a real shame because it had a lot of promise. This one is nonetheless a pretty simple explanation with it just wasn't very fun. That does, however, bring us to number 4 on the list, which is actually Mass Effect Andromeda. And while Mass Effect Andromeda is a game that evokes a lot of feelings in people thanks to the way it launched with a lot of bugs and issues, after playing through the Mass Effect series, I decided that I needed to know why people were so upset with Andromeda, so I played through it. And while there are certainly parts of that game I didn't like, it also has a really fantastic combat system that I had a lot of fun messing around with. It also had some interesting story, plot threads, etc. that never really got a chance to go anywhere with DLC because all that was canned after its disastrous launch. With my review for this one basically summarizing that it's not as bad as everyone makes it out to be, but it's certainly not great either. However, the reason I wouldn't recommend you 100% this one is down to things a little more technical in nature. Simply put, it's incredibly tedious. In order to travel from, say, one planet to another, you've got to go through about 6 different loading screens, which is why one of the popular mods for this game addresses that, especially since even if you're being efficient and trying to move planets as little as possible, you're still going to be sent all over the place in terms of your destination, going back and forth, which means you're going to spend a lot of time traveling and it gets old pretty quick. So when you're trying to do all of those quests to get the viability on each of the planets up to 100%, that is to say make them more livable as you're supposed to be exploring this galaxy and making a home for yourself, which naturally already involves a bit of busy work, gets made incredibly dull by the simple act of going from planet to planet taking forever. Which means for this one, I could hardly recommend you try to do everything. I would say Andromeda, if you can get it on a pretty good sale, is worth running through the main story and just kind of seeing what was what, as again, it's not as bad as people make it out to be, but trying to do everything this game has to offer is an exercise in tedium that I did not enjoy. However, that brings us to our final entry with a game I haven't talked about in forever, and this is 2014's Thief, a reboot of sorts for the Thief series. It's mostly a pretty good game. As the name would imply, we are a thief, which means sneaking around, trying to avoid enemies, hoovering up all the loot we can find, while unraveling a surprisingly interesting narrative that surrounds our master thief Garrett. Another game I haven't actually reviewed, but do have the 100% on, and much like The Witcher 2, it's one that I worked on here and there over the course of years, as I really hate to leave things undone. Also like The Witcher 2, I started this one before this channel even existed by almost 2 years, and I really enjoyed it. And while I'm sure there's a lot people could say about what they did or didn't like about it as a reboot, the reason it makes this list is actually one achievement that was a real nightmare. And that was the Finders Keepers secret, which requires you to discover all the secrets in the game. Or all the secret areas, I should say. The problem is there's actually no way to track this in-game. Like, there's nothing that tells you that you found these areas. There's no way to know what you have found and what you haven't found, which means it's basically just a lot of guesswork that's impossible to keep track of, which means the most efficient way to do this is basically start at the beginning, follow a guide, and grab every single one along the way. As, if my memory serves, the only cue that you have otherwise that you found a secret area is that there is like an audio that plays or something. It's been a little while, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. So trying to do that on your own is an absolute nightmare. So that achievement alone is incredibly annoying and is going to keep most people from getting this, but that's to say nothing of the other achievements, like the one that requires you to play with a custom difficulty of like 700 points, as the game had this difficulty system that allowed you to turn certain helpful features off, which would then give the difficulty a score rating. And there's an achievement for turning most everything in terms of your UI and things like that off, on top of being not allowed to kill anyone without getting a game over, essentially turning that achievement into a sort of perfect stealth run while also not being seen or heard by anyone, which was also a real nightmare to get finished. But nonetheless, I enjoyed the base game of Thief quite a bit, but it was certainly an example of a game that had incredibly tedious achievements that really put a damper on the 100%, and as a result, I didn't get around to finishing this one until I was doing this for a living. And even then it was because I had the time, as I obviously still haven't made a review of that game, but it's definitely not something I would recommend most people do. That said, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. That's been 5 games I don't think were really worth the 100%, or getting 100% was a detriment to the experience in some way, that kind of thing. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. Do let me know down below about any games that were particularly difficult to 100%, or anything you found exceptionally tedious. I know there are plenty of games out there where getting 100% is near impossible, or in some cases these days literally, as games with multiplayer achievements that then go on to have dead servers are often left with, as an example. But in any event, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.